Hey guys, today I want to take a look at our endocrine system. Our endocrine system is our body's, it's another messaging system. It actually is very, very similar to our nervous system, which we've already chatted about. We talked about how the nervous system is a messaging system that sends a series of electrical messages throughout our body so that our body knows how to respond to certain situations. Well, our endocrine system is also very, very similar in that it sends now chemical messengers throughout our body. These chemical messengers, called hormones, are going to send different signals to different target tissues, meaning the organs that they're going to act upon, and then those organs will respond in certain situations. Some hormones that we're already familiar with, just to give you an example, we are probably pretty familiar with what we're going to call epinephrine in this chapter, but we commonly refer to epinephrine as adrenaline. And what happens when adrenaline is running through our body in the event of some type of emergency situation or just something that gets us really, really excited, the adrenaline courses through our body and it causes our heart rate to increase. It causes our breathing to increase, very, very similar to the sympathetic nervous system. So adrenaline is a hormone, and what it does is it sends a signal to these particular organs, causing them to react in that way because we need added oxygen, we need just all kinds of, in a survival mode, we need things to respond accordingly. So that's just one example, but today we're going to take a look at lots of different examples of these hormones. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So let me share the PowerPoint with you guys. Here we go. All right, so taking a look at chapter 14, the endocrine system. All right, so in this chapter, we are going to take a look at the functions of the endocrine system. We're going to take a look at the role and function of different hormones in the body. So we're going to first take a look at what the word hormone means, which I've kind of already explained that to you. Explain the process by which the hormones bind. I've taken the specifics of this out of your all's PowerPoint. It is the way that hormones work. I'll kind of go into a little bit of detail about that. But hormones, again, are only designed to target a particular tissue. So for instance, in the example I just gave you with adrenaline, or again, we're going to call it epinephrine, but epinephrine is going to try to target the lungs, for instance, to try and enhance our breathing. So how does it know to go to the lungs? Well, kind of like a lock and key mechanism, that hormones know to, based on their shape or based on, what their job is, they know to look for a certain receptor. Just like in the nervous system, how our nervous system had receptors that received that stimulus, the hormones work a very similar way. So we'll talk briefly about that, but not in great detail. We'll take a look at the mechanisms that control the secretion of hormones. So I'll go into that and show you what I mean and kind of give you an example as we go through all of the different hormones today too. And then in this section, we're going to take a look at one of our first glands. Gland is just simply what secretes the hormones, and that will make sense when we get into this. But we'll take a look at our pituitary gland, which is, even though it is the smallest of all of our glands, it is probably the most important because of all the hormones that it does secrete. So we'll take a look at the relationship to the brain. So we'll see how it's really, real close to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus in the brain, which we've already talked a little bit about. But we'll talk about how closely they are related. And then we'll look at the location, regulation, and hormones of that particular gland. All right, so here's what you guys are taking a look at in your book. So an introduction into this chapter, endocrine glands, they are what's called ductless glands. When I use the word duct, I oftentimes think of like the duct work in our house, that the furnace and air conditioning unit send our heat and air through a series of tubes into each particular room. And my room has a vent in it where that heat and air can come through. So we have a lot of ducted glands. They are what's called exocrine glands. In this chapter, again, the prefix endo, think of the word or the prefix endo meaning inside. All of our endocrine gland secretions are secreted directly into the bloodstream and remain inside of the body to, cause their reaction to the body. They're eventually going to be eliminated through the process of, elimination in our body through either our kidneys or somehow. But they all are going to remain inside the body to do their job. So our ducted glands, what we call again exocrine, the prefix exo means that their prefixes means that their secretions will exit the body, is a way to think about that. We've talked about a few exocrine glands already, and I think we've already talked a little bit about that term exocrine. But sweat glands is a great example of an exocrine gland. That the particular sweat gland we know is located deep in the dermis, and that sweat is produced in the sweat gland, and the sweat will then go through a tube or a duct and then out through our pores of our skin in order to perform its task of cooling off the body and removing of heat. So that's just one example. Tears, saliva, all of those are a great example of ducted or exocrine glands where their secretions will exit. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, so what you guys see on the screen there, they are considered ductless. What happens is these particular glands will simply secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream, and it's the bloodstream that acts as that delivery system, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, how the blood is our delivery system of our body. So the blood will then take it to their specific target tissues, and the hormones know how to act upon those. So we're going to look at a few endocrine glands today. Their job is to secrete these hormones. They are widely distributed throughout the body, as you can see on your screen here, that here are, the series of glands and organs that we have in our endocrine system. I have provided with you guys a labeling sheet for the endocrine system, and it is the next slide here. And so you guys can find this in your review section, and we can label these together. So I do want to go ahead and identify the main glands of our endocrine system, as we then will go into each of these individually throughout the chapter. So I'm just going to start here at the very beginning and take a look at number one. Number one is pointing to a gland that's located on top of our trachea, which is our windpipe in our neck that is the pathway for air into our lungs. But right on top of that, this gland doesn't really have anything to do with respiration, but it's just where it sits in our body, and that is called the thyroid gland. And we'll talk individually about, like I said, about this gland and about each of these. But I just want to label these so you guys can see where these are located in the body. So number one is the thyroid. On number two, you can see in parentheses, it says that it is on the posterior side of the thyroid. We know posterior means back. If you were to turn the thyroid gland around, you would see 4 small little dots on the back of the thyroid gland, and those are your parathyroid glands. So we just take the word thyroid and add the prefix para, P-A-R-A, in front of that, and that's what you're seeing on the back side of the thyroid. So number one is the thyroid. Number two is the parathyroid then, right on the back side of it. Number three is pointing out these glands that sit right on top of our kidneys. So our kidneys don't really have much to do with our endocrine system, but because of the positioning of these glands, it is important to know that the kidneys are there. Because they sit right on top of them. These are called the adrenal glands. So we have a set of adrenal glands here because most of us have 2 kidneys, so we have 2 adrenal glands. All right, positioned between the kidneys, we have this kind of elongated organ right here, and this organ is very important, and we'll see it is involved in actually 2 of our body systems. This is the pancreas. We're going to see its role today in hormone production and its regulation of our blood sugar. Whereas then in our digestive system, when we talk about that in a couple weeks, we'll talk about how the pancreas is going to help with digestion too. All right, number 5, this is that first gland that we're going to talk about. Even though it's the smallest gland in our body, it is probably the most important because we're going to see a tremendous amount of hormones coming from this gland. Number 5 is the pituitary gland. You can see its location right next to the hypothalamus in our brain. It is only about the size of a pea, but there's a small indentation in our skull, in our brain, you know, in our, where our, not in our brain, in our skull where it actually sits, and it can be protected in there. So even though it's only the size of a pea, it is very important, and we'll get into that pretty soon here. Going down here, number 6 and 7 down at the bottom, you can see are dependent on whether or not we are looking at a female or a male. So number 6 is pointing out our gonads. This is what we oftentimes refer to as the sex glands. So specifically the gonads in the female are called the ovaries. So number 6 is pointing out the ovaries. And number 7, the sex glands or gonads in the male are called the testes. We will see both of these glands once again when we cover reproduction at the end of the quarter because of their involvement in sex cell production. So our ovaries are responsible for creation of our egg cells, and then the testes are responsible for sperm cell production. So in the role of fertilization and producing of an offspring, we'll see that again. Here we're going to talk about their role in producing things like estrogen and progesterone in the females, and then testosterone in the males. So we'll get into that. Number 8, also going back up towards the brain. This is actually located between our 2 cerebral hemispheres in our brain. Number 8 is pointing out the pineal gland. The pineal. This one's only going to secrete 1. So compared to the pituitary, which is right in front of it, this is actually only going to secrete 1 hormone that we're going to talk about today. Whereas the pituitary secretes quite a bit more. It secretes 9 different hormones. I think we're only going to talk about 8 of them though. All right, and then lastly, number 9, in some labeling sheets might not, so I can't remember if the one in your book shows this one or not. Okay, it does. Sometimes you might not see these in certain diagrams or see this particular gland, because most of the time this gland has actually disappeared by adulthood, or it has shrunk tremendously in size. Number 9 is pointing out the thymus. And we'll talk about why it is only really important in childhood and adolescence. It starts to kind of shrink after adolescence because it's not really needed anymore. So that's why you don't, you oftentimes might not see those on certain, again, pictures of our endocrine system. All right, so that's where all of our different glands are located. So not a tremendous labeling diagram you're seeing here. Our focus is today, again, we do want to know and pinpoint where each of these are. So that's why the labeling diagram here is important. But we're going to actually go into each of these, and I want you guys to focus on, as we go through these throughout the chapter, how many, you know, not just how many, but what hormones these glands will secrete and what those hormones do to our body. So I have actually also on the review section, I have provided you guys a table. It's a chart that I found somewhere online that can be very helpful, that shows, it puts the gland in one column. In the next column, it shows what hormones come from that gland. And then in the last column, it shows then what those do. And that's what I want you guys to focus on. We'll get into a little bit more with that, just to, you know, to explain that. But I think that can be really, really helpful in understanding what these different hormones do for our body. And that's the focus today. All right, so let's talk about these. So what is a hormone? As I mentioned briefly earlier, these are chemical messengers, very, very similar to the messages produced in our nervous system. Those are more on the electrical side of things, that our brain produces an impulse that sends that through a nerve pathway. Here, these are chemicals that are created all really kind of throughout the body, depending on the situation that we're in at the time. Those chemical messengers will influence or control different activities of other tissues and organs in our body. They are classified certain ways, and we actually don't get into great detail about these. And the chart that I gave you guys also gives you the type of hormone that they are. Sometimes hormones are classified as different proteins and protein-related substances, such as amino acids or a steroid. And again, I'm not going to worry too much about those, so don't really worry too much about the classification, but that is how they are classified. Again, hormones are specifically targeting certain things in the body. So many target tissues result in more widespread effects. So certain target tissues are kind of influencing all kinds of things throughout the body, whereas fewer target tissues with fewer target tissues come fewer effects. So the main thing to know from this is what a target tissue is, that the hormone itself is acting upon something else in our body, and that is what will produce a response. So everything we will go through today, as we go through the different glands, I'll talk to you guys about what the hormone is trying to target, and that's what I mean by that. Our hormones are actually controlled by a variety of different mechanisms in our body. We have what's called feedback control. All of our hormones act through either what's called a negative feedback or a positive feedback. And I'm going to get into these individually and try to explain that in a way that's a little bit easier than the way that the book explains it. And again, as we go through each of our hormones, I'll explain to you guys what I mean by the feedback and which one is it's utilizing. Some hormones work because of biorhythms in our body, such as the circadian rhythm in our body, which tells us how we, when we need to go to sleep, when we need to wake up, like our biological clock. Our brain needs to sleep. There is one hormone that we'll talk about today that helps us maintain that circadian rhythm. It helps to tell us when we need to go to sleep. It is secreted at that time, and then it kind of turns off when it's time for us to wake up. So I'll explain that. And then we have monthly, I'm not circadian, but monthly biorhythms, especially in the female system. We have hormones that help to control our menstrual cycle. And so monthly, we are secreting certain hormones at a certain time throughout our cycle. And that is, very much influenced on how our body responds. And then our central nervous system. So you see psycho, neuro, endocrinology. That term just means that there are certain hormones that we'll see that will be very much influenced by our brain. So we'll talk today about how the pituitary gland is directly connected to the hypothalamus, and it will have a big effect on our endocrine glands as well. So our central nervous system will be something that controls our hormone secretions as well. So let's talk about that feedback loop that I was telling you about. So the majority of our hormones actually work through what's called a negative feedback loop. They're given a specific example of a hormone that we haven't discussed yet. So this is something that we will get into. Cortisol is a hormone secreted by those those adrenal glands that we talked about that sit on top of the kidneys. But what the negative feedback loop means is what happens when we need this particular hormone. The negative feedback loop will stimulate the hormone to, send its secretions into the body. Once the body responds the way it needs to, that hormone will be shut off because we don't need it anymore. It has responded. And that's what that means here. It shows that, rises in the blood to the needed level. Cortisol will then shut off any further secretion of ACTH, which is another hormone. So it there's the feedback. The feedback is that it turns off. The best way to think about a negative feedback loop, and what I mean by this, the hormones that work through a negative feedback loop, their job is to return us to normal, to get our body back to homeostasis. Example that that really is one that we could probably think of that we may be familiar with, insulin. Insulin is something that helps to regulate our blood sugar. When I eat a piece of apple pie, what's going to happen to my blood sugar is it's going to spike. Again, this is normal. So what happens is my body secretes insulin, and insulin takes it back to normal. Once it gets back to normal, insulin is shut off because I don't need it anymore. If I were to keep secreting insulin, what would happen is glucose would go lower and lower and lower and going beyond normal. I want it to be normal. So a negative feedback loop works in that way, is that it turns off once we've reached that state of homeostasis. A great analogy, I had another teacher that told me that she likes to use this analogy. Imagine the thermostat in your house. The thermostat in your house is set to a particular temperature. What happens when the air kicks on and gets it to that particular temperature? It shuts off, right? that it doesn't continue blowing cold air into your house, otherwise you'd live in an icebox. That's how a thermostat works. A thermostat also works through a negative feedback loop, that it sends the thermostat, if you say set it to, say, 65. You set it to 65, so your furnace and your air conditioning unit knows how to, get it to that point. That's the signal. It's not, okay, so let's say it's it's really cold outside and it's, under the temperature of 65. So your furnace has to kick on to send some heat into your house. You want it to stop at 65 according to your thermostat that you set it to. So once it reaches that level, the furnace kicks off once it does, and that's the negative feedback. So hormones work in a very similar way, and we'll see that in a variety of different examples as we go through our hormones today, that once we get to that level of normalcy, then it will shut off because we don't need it any longer. A positive feedback loop is the opposite. What happens is, as a bodily change will stimulate further change moving in the same direction. So in other words, what it does is it takes our body out of normal. A great example would be the hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that we'll talk about when we cover the pituitary gland. Oxytocin's job is to stimulate childbirth. Obviously, as we're sitting here watching these videos right now, for those women in the class, our uterus is not contracting right now because it would be abnormal for that to happen. In the event that childbirth needs to happen, when it's time to deliver a baby, during labor, the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix will stimulate the release of that hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin will then stimulate the uterus to contract, therefore furthering the pressure on the cervix. Again, taking the body out of normal, but for the purpose of creating some type of response. We need this baby to be delivered. So more oxytocin will be continually released until that delivery. So again, a negative feedback loop is designed to get us back to normal. Those hormones, the job of that hormone is to get us back to normal, and then it will turn off once we reach normal. Whereas a positive feedback loop, we're already at normal. But what happens is that particular hormone, their job is to take us out of that normal level for some type of reason. Adrenaline is another example that works in that way, that even though, our heart is beating normally right now, if something were to come into the room and startle me, my adrenaline is going to start pumping, causing my heart and lungs to respond. So that's the reason for it, that I need to defend myself. I might think that, oh my gosh, what is that? And so that's why adrenaline is going to push through our system and cause my body to go out of ordinary. It's going to cause my heart rate to increase for that reason. So that's a positive feedback loop. So that's really the best way to remember the difference between negative and positive feedback. Negative gets us back to normal. Positive takes us out of normal, if that helps. All right, so let's get into the pituitary gland first. So the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, again, are right next to each other. We saw that in that picture. The hypothalamus is going to help to control that pituitary function. It is directly connected. The pituitary gland, we'll get into this right now, but the pituitary gland has two different lobes in it. If you were to look at a picture of it, there's kind of a bump in the front and then a bump in the back is kind of how that looks. And those are different lobes. The anterior pituitary secretes its own hormones, and the one in the back, the posterior pituitary, secretes its own hormones as well. So when you hear me say anterior versus posterior pituitary, we can almost look at them as two different glands. So the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary through our blood capillaries, and then the posterior pituitary through tissue itself. So the main thing I want you guys to grasp from this slide is just know that the hypothalamus very much has a direct influence on how our pituitary gland will secrete its hormones. But I do want you guys to just know what those specific hormones are. So as I mentioned just a second ago, the pituitary gland does have two parts. The anterior pituitary, sometimes referred to as the adenohypophysis, if you ever hear that, it's just talking about the front part of the pituitary. It is controlled by releasing hormones of the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, sometimes referred to as the neurohypophysis, is simply just its own extension of the hypothalamus. The main thing, again, I want you guys to know from this is what the hormones are. So let's get into that. So first, we're going to talk about the anterior. So here in this picture, you can see there are two lobes to the pituitary gland. Here is the anterior lobe. It's a little bit bigger. And so a way to remember that the anterior lobe actually secretes more hormones. We're going to see 6 different hormones today. And then the posterior lobe, we're only going to talk about 2 different hormones that come from that side. So here is why and most of the hormones that we'll look at today, most of the glands that we'll take a look at, the ones that we labeled on our diagram, only secrete anywhere from about 1 to 3 hormones. So it's nothing that, too excruciating. The pituitary gland, you guys can see here, secreting 8 different hormones is kind of our exception. So let's take a look at what these are. So we have what's called trophic hormones that come from the anterior side. And I want you guys to be familiar with each of these individually, and I'm going to go into these. In fact, I think, we'll talk about these individually here. So first, we're going to start with the first one of the anterior pituitary, called growth hormone. Growth hormone does exactly what the name implies. It is simply just responsible for a lot of the growth in our body. It is sometimes referred to as somatotropin. So if you ever hear that, you will see, again, that it's just referring to the growth hormone. So on a test, I will refer to both of them. So however you studied that, just know that. Anywhere you also see in the endocrine chapter, guys, anywhere you see any abbreviations, on a test, I always use both the word and the abbreviation. So however you studied that, just know that you'll see both on the test. So the growth hormone, again, as it mentions here, it affects bones, cartilage, skeletal muscles, causes the amino acids to build up into proteins and fats to be used for energy, helps to convert protein to glucose. It has a profound effect on our growth. And that is the biggest thing I want you guys to take from this, is the growth hormone stimulates growth in our body. And that's what it's doing. It's taking just different things in our body and helping those to grow. So this is going to be more vastly produced in childhood. As children are growing more, their bones are getting taller, and things of that nature. But we still see growth hormone in our bodies, is that we are still producing new cells and new tissues when needed. So the growth hormone is responsible there. All right. Prolactin comes from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin, the easiest way to remember prolactin, within that word, you see this LAC, or LACT, meaning lact. That always helps me to draw that association to lactation. So it's also called the lactogenic hormone. Its job is to simply just stimulate the growth of the mammary glands. So after pregnancy, it is very much responsible for a woman's role in feeding her offspring. So it's going to help stimulate the growth of those and the creation of milk within a woman's breasts. All right. Our trophic hormones, these are the ones that have an influence on other endocrine glands in our body. So these 4 that we're seeing on our slide here, TSH, also known as the thyroid stimulating hormone. Sometimes you see that as thyrotropin. More commonly, you will see that as the thyroid stimulating hormone, because it does exactly that. We'll talk about what the thyroid gland does in the next video, and what its role is in the body. This hormone from the pituitary gland actually stimulates that to work. So this particular hormone actually works in kind of a chain reaction, that I'll tell you that what the thyroid hormone is going to do, the one we'll talk about in the thyroid gland, helps to increase our metabolism. So what happens when our metabolism levels fall? Are actually the pituitary gland recognizes that first, stimulates TSH. It will then target the thyroid, telling the thyroid to then release its hormones, and therefore increasing metabolism the way that it should. Very, very similar here. ACTH, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone, is, you'll be able to see later when we talk about the adrenal glands, that the adrenal cortex specifically has hormones in it that are going to be released from just that part of it. And this hormone stimulates that gland. So that's all you really need to know about that. That the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to release its hormones. The adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to release its hormones. And the gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH, these two actually stimulate our gonads. As you can tell by that prefix in this term here, gonads, as I mentioned earlier, are the sex glands in our body. So these two hormones actually very much have a big role to play in, reproduction. FSH, also known as our follicle stimulating hormone, you can see some more information on that in our text, but the follicle stimulating hormone does that. It stimulates the follicles in a female ovary, for instance. Follicles are, excuse me, follicles in the ovary are actually what is continually growing a female egg throughout that monthly cycle, and eventually leading to ovulation. And ovulation, if sperm cells are present, will then eventually fertilize that egg. So FSH is actually helping to mature that egg cell as it goes through that maturing process. FSH also plays a role in helping with sperm cell production in the male side of that. And then LH, also known as the luteinizing hormone, will then be the next step. FSH is simply just helping with the maturing of that egg cell. LH is then going to be what's responsible for ovulation. It's going to be what stimulates the female body to release that egg cell out of the ovaries so that the egg cell can then make its way into the female fallopian tubes. We'll discuss that later in reproduction. Will make its way to the fallopian tube of the body, or uterine tube, where, if sperm cells will be present, can therefore be fertilized. So that's what I mean by the gonadotropic hormones. Just as kind of a fun fact, when a female is on birth control or when she is pregnant, it's actually these two hormones that are turned off during that time. That's how birth control will work, is it targets FSH and LH to turn off, so therefore there's no egg to fertilize. All right. Now moving to the posterior side of the pituitary gland. So on the back side, again, controlled more by the hypothalamus. Remember, this is also referred to as the neurohypophysis. There's only two hormones that come from this side. We have what's called the antidiuretic hormone, or oftentimes abbreviated as ADH. The antidiuretic hormone, for those of you guys who might be familiar with the term diuretic, oftentimes things like alcohol and caffeine, more so alcohol, are considered diuretics because they make us go to the bathroom more. They make us release, more fluids. Whereas an antidiuretic, or andiuretic, as it mentions here, it's sometimes talked, it's pronounced both ways. But an antidiuretic would be the opposite, that it is going to halt that production of removal of water. So what ADH does, very, very similar to our albumin protein that we talked about in our blood chapter when we talked about our plasma proteins, it works a very similar way, that it recognizes when our blood volume of water is low. So ADH will target the kidneys and say, hey, no producing of urine right now. We need to hold on to some of this water. So that's what that ADH will do for us. And oxytocin, we briefly talked about that a little bit earlier. Oxytocin is going to be what stimulates a lot of different contractions in the body, more so, as we mentioned before, when we were talking about the positive feedback loop. Oxytocin will stimulate labor to stimulate those uterine contractions during childbirth. So I think we talked about that a little bit more here. So again, the antidiuretic hormone, as it mentions there, is released to conserve water, so its target is the kidney. In the absence of ADH, this will result in diabetes insipidus, which again will just be very similar, that the water will be removed and can cause a lot of issues in our body. This will cause blood vessels to in turn constrict, which will then elevate blood pressure, and high blood pressure can then cause a lot of issues. But that's what the antidiuretic hormone does. So that's the main thing to remember with that. And as I mentioned, then oxytocin's job is to stimulate different contractions of the body. Specifically the uterus, we mentioned that earlier. The uterus is going to be contracting during childbirth, and oxytocin is what's targeting that and making that happen. But also oxytocin will stimulate the mammary glands in the event of breastfeeding. So we talked about how prolactin, the hormone that came from the anterior side of the pituitary gland, helps to create the mammary glands, helps to stimulate that milk production. Whereas here, this is going to help the milk release. So the nervous system sends a signal to, via a neuroendocrine reflex. This is one of those controls I was talking about earlier, about how the central nervous system helps to control the release of different hormones. It's actually the sound of your baby crying that will then send a signal to your pituitary gland, causing you to release oxytocin. And in that case, when the baby needs to be fed, so oxytocin will be released and stimulate that contraction of the smooth muscle around those mammary ducts to release that milk. So it's really kind of an interesting process. All right, but that's oxytocin. All right, guys, so before we get into lesson 2, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here, and we'll go ahead and then move on to lesson 2. So let's stop at this point, and you guys can go ahead and move on.